Welcome back to the programme. Now, the Global Sound Movement is a group made up of staff and students from the University of Central Lancashire who record rare instruments from around the world that you and I probably have never heard of. They even offer these sounds to producers right here in the UK. The group work with small unknown communities from around the world and fund each musician they collaborate with. Back from their last trip to Bali in Indonesia, Phil Holmes, one of the co-founders of the Global Sound Movement, joins me now.
Hello. Hello.
Okay, so first of all, tell me, what is the Global Sound Movement? What is it all about?
So the Global Sound Movement is a team of researchers and students from the University of Central Lancashire, students working on the BA Honours Music Production degree. Now, we've got a keen interest in instruments that are hand-built and completely unique to specific geographical areas. So most of these areas are in either social or economic need, and what we do as an organisation is visit these communities and make recordings of these instruments through a process called sampling, and we sample each note in the region of 25 times, which is quite laborious. And once we've made these recordings, we bring them back to the university where we can generate virtual instruments where music producers and composers can actually play the instruments that we've recorded themselves. We then sell these virtual instruments, and all the money that we make goes back to the instrument makers in the country that we visited.
And you mentioned that we mentioned earlier that the instruments that we would have never heard of. Give us an example of what are they like? What do you find?
Well, it depends on the country and depends where we actually are. But one does spring to mind recently. We visited Indonesia, and specifically the island of Bali. And whilst we were there, we met a gentleman who is interested in building sustainable musical instruments. So rather than use wood and assist with the deforestation of Indonesia, he's using bamboo. So he's making guitars and electric guitars out of bamboo, didgeridoos and drums, and he makes instruments that are all of those three things. So he can play guitar, be playing the didgeridoo, and having a percussive element to this instrument as well at the same time. I'd never seen one of these things before, and I don't think I ever will again. So having the opportunity to work with him, record him, sample him was fantastic, really. And the students that were on the trip as well got so much out of that.
And what inspired the trip to Bali?
The trip to Bali came from research into, through our research into old instruments and ancient music and different types of music. We came across an instrument called the Moon of Japang, which is the which is the oldest percussion instrument in the world. It was built 300 BC, our research leads us to believe, and in essence it's the largest single cast steel drum ever. And it's actually in a temple in Bali. So the Global Sound Movement were in search of the Moon of Japang, which is why we selected Bali and which is why we went out there. And
how do you find, you said before that you found this person that created these instruments. How do you do the research beforehand, or is it simply a case of when you get there, figure it out?
Well, we do as much research before we get there as we possibly can. Obviously, as I always tell my students, perfect planning prevents pathetic performance. So we try and plan these trips to as much detail as we possibly can. However, when you are on location out there, things do change, and people may not be where they said they were going to be, etc, etc. So the gentleman who made the bamboo instruments, we hadn't contacted him before we went out, but through other contacts that we had when we were there in the early part of the week, we were put in contact whilst we were out there, and that developed. So it's a mixture of both, really, but we've always got to improvise, adapt and overcome when we're in the field.
And who did you work with whilst you were in Bali, and how did it compare to the work that you did in Africa?
We worked with a couple of non-government organisations who put us in contact with very different kind of musical community groups, and there was one specific one which came through the Bali Children's Project, who are an organisation set up to sponsor children through education. They actually knew of a musical group of children up towards the mountains, and we travelled up to see them, and we worked with their group, which is headed by the conductor, who's called Anom, and Anom is 13 years old. Him and his sister unfortunately lost their father a number of years ago, and the family are suffering financial difficulties. That said, Anom is an incredible musician. He practices very hard on all different aspects and instruments from the gamelan orchestra, and his sister's very good, a very good musician too. So we went to meet them. We had the absolute joy of working with him and his musical group of children aged from, I think the youngest was 6 all the way up to kind of 14. And we spent an afternoon recording each of their instruments, and then we've recorded some of their performances as well, and hopefully we'll send those back to those guys to listen to their recordings, and hopefully we can generate some instruments from what we recorded. And
what response do you get from the people that you do record? Would they have this opportunity otherwise?
Very often, no. When we were in Africa, the idea of actually recording sound, I think, was a concept that they'd never come across. Similarly, places in Bali, but to a lesser extent, I think Indonesia, or the areas of Bali we were, are slightly more developed than the areas of Central Africa. But one thing is in common, whether we're in Bali, Africa, Cyprus, is that everybody really enjoys the experience, and as a musician you very often perform or rehearse, and recording something that's quite a different process really, and I think having the opportunity to kind of have your work committed to records quite good, and we always try and get on with the musicians and they always get on with us, and by the end of the recording sessions we're all playing football together or high-fiving or playing chase, you know, whatever, you know, wherever we are. So it's really good, and it's good to keep in contact with them as well.
It's fascinating work that you do. What is next for you? You've actually been shortlisted, for an award, haven't you?
We have, yes. The Global Sound Movement as a project has been shortlisted for the Times Higher Education 2016 Fabulous, Excellence and Innovation in the Arts Award.
Amazing.
So we've been shortlisted at the moment, and ask me in November, because that's when the awards are.
We will do. Thank you for coming in today.
You're very welcome. Thank you very
much.
Cheers.